Hi, Zach Reiser here, and I'm back with another bass effects review video. Today is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be more of a tutorial rather than a review. I'm going to be talking about some of the advanced features of the Boss ES-8 that I use in some of my patches that I showed in my Boss ES-8 review video, which will be linked below. So there's not going to be a whole lot of bass playing in this video. It's mostly going to be a lot of menu diving. Okay, let's get right into it. So I'm not going to be talking about any of the basic features of the ES-8, things like how to save presets, how to choose which loops are active, how to change the effect order, etc. These are all pretty well covered in the menu and also a bunch of other great review videos out there. So let's start with how to set up a tap tempo switch, an external tap tempo switch. Now you could do this with any of the onboard buttons as well. So for instance, if you wanted to turn the memory manual or the mute button into a tap tempo, you could do that. But I'm going to show you how to set it up with an external button, which I have over here. So the first thing is you got to plug in the external button into one of the 4 control inputs on the back. I have mine chosen to be control input 1. Then you go into the edit menu, you slide over to control expression, press enter, and then you have to go all the way till you get to control 1. So this is basically for every button on the ES-8, memory manual, mute, bank up, bank down, number 1 through 8, etc. You can change their actual functions. They don't have to do the functions that they're initially set up to be. So now we get to control input 1. So let's go into this menu, and you can see I have the function set up to be BPM. So this is going to set up the tap tempo button here to control the BPM of the Boss ES-8. Now I will say that if you run a MIDI clock into your Boss ES-8, this gets overridden if you have it set up on the clock set up to be on auto. So in other words, if I was running a clock from my looper into the Boss ES-8, this tap tempo button would not change the tempo of each patch. The MIDI clock from the looper would change it. But if it's set up without any kind of MIDI clock coming in, this will control the tempo. So it's set up on function BPM, and you can see we can change this function to all kinds of different things from from Midi CCs to program changes, whatever. But I choose it to be BPM. And now if we back out to the front page, you can see in the bottom here it says 95. If I click faster, you can see now it says 215. Now it says 98. You also can probably see on the 2H9s, those are changing tempo as well because I have the Boss ES-8 set up to send a MIDI clock to any of my MIDI devices. And really quick, I'll show you how you do that. So if you go to Edit and you go over to the MIDI setting menu and you go to the clock out, I have set to be on, which is basically this is sending a clock from its BPM per patch, and you can see I have the sync set to auto, which is what I was talking about earlier. So it's set up to figure out if it gets a clock, it uses the incoming clock. If it doesn't get a clock, it uses the tap tempo button. And then obviously you have to set up your H9s or your Strymons on those boxes to receive the MIDI clock, but that's a different thing for a different video. So setting up a tap tempo button, pretty simple. Now, if you wanted, you don't have to use an external tap tempo like I said. So you could set up any button to be your tap tempo. So let's say we want to make the mute button our tap tempo. Well, now we would go to control expression. We'd go to the mute here, right there. We can see right now I have the function actually to off, and I'll get to that later why I have that. But if we take this and we put the mute function all the way over to BPM, now when I back out here, my mute button, you can see is changing the tap tempo. So that's how you set up an onboard button to be your tap tempo rather than an external button. Okay, now I want to talk about how to take the same tap tempo button that's controlling the patch tempo on the ES-8, but also have it send an analog tap tempo to an analog device. So in the corner up there, you can see the Chase Bliss tonal recall sitting there, and it's an analog delay, but it has a tap tempo input. So this is going from, this tap tempo button is being sent to the control input 1, and then from the control output 1, I'm sending that to the Chase Bliss. So to get that to function with the Chase Bliss, I have to do 2 things. And this is assuming this is already set up to be my tap tempo button for the ES-8. I have to go to patch, and I need to slide over until I get to this screen, which is Control 1, Control 2, Control 3. Now, this is a little bit confusing. These are not your inputs. These are your output controls. So Control Output 1 is what's being sent to the chase bus. So I would go down here, and I would click Enter, and I would shift this from off to on. After I've done that, that's just turning the output on. I have to actually go in and set up an assign to send tap tempo to that output. So I would slide I went into Control, let me back up here, I went into Control expression, and I went all the way to the right until I get to the assigns. There's 12 assigns you can use. I choose number 8 for my tap tempo just because it usually is out of my way. I go in here, and now you can see that I have the switch set to be on. The source is this control button. So let's say that I want the source to be my mute button for my tap tempo like I did before. Then I would go down here, slide over to Control, and I would change this to mute instead of Control 1. So you can change this to any button. You can see there's mute right there. So I'll switch it back to Control 1. That means this button is controlling tap tempo. I have it set up to be a momentary because I don't want it to be a toggle switch. It's just a tap tempo. And that's really all you have to worry about to set up tap tempo, except you have to tell it where you're going to send this to. So you slide over one panel, and you can see that I have it says external control for the Kate, and then the target is Control 1. Now this is confusing, I know. The source is this Control 1. When it says target, it's talking about the output Control 1, Control 1 through 6, not Control input 1 through 4. So you have to make sure that you have the switch on. Your source is this button, Control input. It's a momentary switch. It's an external controller, and it's being sent to output 1. So I'll show you what that does here with the chase bliss. So I'll tap into tempo, and then I'll tap into faster tempo. So now, the cool thing here, though, is that if I'm not using MIDI, my analog delays are tapped in via this tap tempo switch, but this is also tapping in the tempo on the ES-8, which is sending a MIDI clock to my digital delays on the Eventide H9. So now my analog and my digital delays are all tapped into the same single tap tempo button, which is an incredibly cool feature. Okay, so as you just saw, the assign 1 through 12 is an incredibly amazingly useful tool. And this is honestly where I'm going to spend most of the rest of this video because you can do so much with these 12 assigns. And these are per preset. So I'll give you an example. In my preset 1 here, this is my dry bass patch. So this is just dry bass, nothing else on there. No loops are turned on. Now, normally the mute switch is just a mute. It turns off my input signal going to the output, so it's just a mute, which to me was fine, but I wanted to kind of kill two birds with one stone. So what I did is I chose to disengage the mute function of the ES-8, and I chose to have it simultaneously turn on loop 8, which is this H9, and also via MIDI turn the tuner on that H9. So now with one button, I go from being able to play, and then it mutes my signal, but I also have the tuner function you can see up there is now activated on the Eventide H9. So now my mute is also my tuner. Okay, so let's talk about how I did this. So it's all going to be in the control expression menu. So we go to Control Expression, and first thing you have to do is you have to turn off the function of the mute button. This is a little bit confusing, but any of these onboard buttons, if you want to change what they do, you have to turn them off. Essentially, you have to make this button just turn into like an external switch. So I went into mute here, so this is going to the mute switch. I go in, and you can see I have the function set to off. Now normally, it would look like this. The function would normally be set to mute, because it wants to be the mute button, but I'm going to turn the function off. Then after that, we slide over to our assigns, and I have assign 1. Okay, so assign 1, first of all, it's turned on. I have the source, meaning the button that is sending the assign is the mute button right here. It's a momentary switch, not a toggling switch, and I have it set to go to the MIDI channel 2, which is this is on MIDI channel 2. And it's sending this CC, which is 80. And that CC is what turns on the tuner. So when this thing receives Midi CC 80, it turns the tuner on. So I'm having, when I press the mute button, because it's the source, I'm having it send Midi CC 80 on channel 2 to this device to turn on the mute. Now, that wouldn't do anything, though, if I didn't also turn the loop on, because this is not receiving any signal. So for the tuner to work, it has to receive signal. So then we go to assign number 2, And now you can see that the source is also mute, so meaning when I press the mute button, it's doing two things. It's a toggle switch, not a momentary switch, and I'm having it turn on a loop. So when Kate here, if it says loop, it means it's turning on or off a loop, and it's turning on or off loop 8, which is the loop that the second H9 is. So on this particular preset, the mute button is doing two things. It turns on the loop, and via MIDI, it turns on the tuner. So yet again, signal, no tuner going on up here. When I push this button, no signal, and now you see the tuner flickering up there. So now let's talk about how we just do a simple MIDI message send per preset, which is a little bit different. So let's go to preset 3. All right, preset 3 is simply just one of my drives. So it's a little bit of dirt. A little bit of dirt from the Source Audio Aftershock, which is hidden underneath the shelf right there. And it's being sent MIDI presets via the Source Audio Hub, which is also underneath the shelf. So if we go into Patch here, Edit, and we go to Patch, and we slide over to MIDI 1, which is just this is the Source Audio pedals are on MIDI channel 1, so I have that on MIDI 1. You can see the channel is 1. And then over here in PC, it's saying that it's going to send program change 1 when this patch is selected, patch 3. Now if we go over to patch 4, and we go through the same menus, it's patch, MIDI 1, now you see it says PC 2, channel 1. On this. So now if I switch between patch 1 and 2, it's basically sending channel 1 to the Source Audio Aftershock, which is this light overdrive. If I go to this, it's sending program change number 2 on channel 1, which is this kind of heavier distortion. So this preset is simply just sending a different program change to MIDI channel number 1. Now the cool thing is that you can send multiple MIDI program changes at the same time per patch, along with which loops you want turned on and off. So for instance, on this particular patch, Bank 1 Patch 2, it's sending a program change message to the hog to select a 5th with a subtle envelope, and it's also sending a program change to the Aftershock to give me a little bit of dirt, and it's turning on loops 3 and loops 5 so that those pedals are actually receiving signal, so you get this kind of sound. Okay, now if I go to a different bank, like this bank, and I click on something like this patch right here, okay, now I'm getting a particular preset sent to the Strymon, a preset sent to the Eventide, and the hog is also getting some preset, but it is not turned on here, and you get a patch like this. So this preset is not only turning the loops on for the Strymon and the Eventide, it's also sending the MIDI message, the MIDI program change message, to both devices to pick that particular preset on the device, which is incredible. So if we go into the menu real quick just to review that, how we do that, we go to Patch, we go to whichever MIDI channel these are on. This is MIDI channel 2, so I go to MIDI 2. You can see it says channel 2, and it says program change 5. So it's sending the 5th program to this device. This is MIDI channel 3, so I go to MIDI channel 3, you can see it says 3, and this is also happens to be PC change 5, but on the Strymon Mobius. So as you're probably starting to see, I use my mute button basically as an accessory button. I treat it as whatever I want it to do per preset. Usually it's turning on a Midi CC, it's turning on a loop, or something like that. And one of the most common ways I use my mute button or alternate switch button is to give myself kind of a little bit of extra expression per preset. So for instance, on preset 3 here, this is just an overdrive, simple overdrive. Now, instead of doing an entirely separate preset to have overdrive plus really big reverb, I choose to have the mute switch turn on loop 8, which is where my hog is up here. So if I press the mute button here, same preset, I'm not changing the preset, press the mute button. Now I have that same overdrive with this big reverb. If I want to turn the reverb off, I press the mute again, and it's like that. Another example would be on preset 2, okay? This is just my compressor. And now on this, when I press the mute button, it's turning on loop 7, which is what the Mobius is in, for a little bit of a funky envelope effect. So now this is, yet again, I'm not changing the preset. I'm pushing my Alt switch here, the mute button, and now I have this kind of envelope filter funk sound. Want to get rid of the filter, push the mute again. Whoops. Etc. Okay, now how did I do this? It's very similar to how I set up the mute switch on the H9. So I go into Edit, I go to Patch, I go to Controller Expression, and I go to my Assign switch. So first of all, yet again, you have to have the mute switch itself. So I go to the mute switch itself, and its function is off. I'm not muting anymore with the mute switch. I'm using the mute switch as a totally different function. So the function of the mute is off, and then I go to Assign, number 1 here, and I have the Assign on. The source is the mute button. It's a toggle switch because I don't want to have to hold the button down. And now you can see that it's selecting a loop, and it's turning loop 7. It's toggling loop 7 on and off. And that's how I am getting this secondary effect where it's just compressor with filter, and then back to just compressor, all on the same channel. And almost every single preset, I have the mute switch doing something so that I have that little secondary amount of expression available. Couple more advanced features of sending MIDI program changes and CCs. So if we go to preset 1 here, I can't show this very well because I can't use my feet, but this is a freeze setting on the Hog. So if I play a chord and push my expression pedal forward, it holds the chord indefinitely for me. Now normally, to get my dry input going here to play on top of this chord, because right now I'm playing and you can't hear it, but if I go over here and I slide up the dry output slider, now all of a sudden, I can play right on top of that frozen chord. But I don't want the dry output to be there when I change chords so that it's seamless like that. So what I did is via MIDI, I set the mute button up to send the particular CC to the Hog to turn the dry output slider up. So now I can play a chord, hold it, and then when I want to play on top of it, I press mute, and now, and then if I want to turn the dry off, I press mute again, and now I can seamlessly go to my second chord. So this is basically the same function that we did when we were doing the tuner setup on the H9, but I want to show it to you again. So we go to Edit, we go to Control Expression. First off, you have to turn the function of the mute button off. This is key. So if I go to mute, you can see the function is off. Now I go over to Assign. Okay, so we got to get all the way over to Assign 1. And now you can see that on Assign 1, first of all, the Assign is turned on. The source is the mute button. It's a toggle, so when I press it, I have to hold it. And then it's sending MIDI CC number 102 on channel 6, and that's to turn my dry output slider on. So now when I push this mute button, it's sending that MIDI CC channel 6, which is what the Hog is, number 102. And then you also can choose the value of the min and the max. Now in this, it doesn't matter. I wanted full value, so it was just 0 and 127. But I'll show you another Hog preset right now where this is a really cool feature. Okay, so on this preset, if I don't push the mute button, it's just kind of an organish setting. But if I push this mute button, all of a sudden it's sending, I think, 4 different MIDI CCs to give me a totally different preset that's kind of this weird sliding textural sound. Now the key to get that sliding effect is that I have to send a MIDI, I have to send the pitch glide CC, but I can't use the full value. If I sent the full value, it would freeze the chord. So I have to use this intermediate MIDI CC value so that it's not quite freezing the chord, it's just kind of sliding from chord to chord. Same process though, so we go in here, I go to the assigns. Now remember, I had to go to mute and turn the mute function off because I'm using the mute button to send these assigns. I could do all of this with an external button if I wanted to, by the way. You don't have to disengage the mute function. You could do it just like you did the tap tempo earlier. So we go to assign 1, and we see that this is sending MIDI CC 102, okay? So that's what that one is doing, which I think is one of the output sliders. I think it's maybe the dry output slider. Yeah, it is. It's the dry output slider being turned up. If we go to assign 2, this is sending number 87, okay? And now this is one of the other sliders. It's like the 2-octave up slider, I think. And let's see what this one is. So this one, you can see the max is not 127, it's 110. So this is turning a slider like I think the 4th octave up, but it's only turning it up a little bit. It's not turning it up all the way. So you can choose all of these assigns from one button to send multiple MIDI CCs at the same time in real time. And then assign 4, I'm pretty sure, there it is. So the max is 65. So this is the freeze gliss CC that's being sent here, and I'm only sending it basically half value, which is why it's not freezing. And all of these CCs, all 4 of them, are being sent with the source button for the sending being the mute button. Really complicated, I know. Go back and watch the video again if you're confused, or send me a question below. It's really complex, and I really wish that the Boss ES-8 had an editor, but unfortunately it doesn't, so you just have to deal with it. But the power of this device makes it worth going through the pain of programming these things in the menu. Okay, lastly, I want to talk about spillover, because this is something that a lot of people have a hard time with because the manual is not very clear. So when you want to set up spillover, the confusing thing, or trails, is that you actually don't do it on the preset that you're on, you do it on the preset that you're going to. So in other words, if you wanted your delay tail to go over the line from preset 1 to preset 2 or something like that, you have to have the trails set up on preset 2, the preset you're going to. Now, to get by this annoying thing, for me, on every single preset, I saved trails, so I never have to think about if I'm going to go over to a different effect and I want the trails to go. So let's pull up a sound here. So here's my dry bass. Actually, let's do a compressor, a little bit of overdrive. Okay, and let's turn a reverb on. Now you can hear I switched presets and my trails kept going. So let's listen to that again. So here's that overdrive with the reverb. Change to a higher drive, and the trails continue over even though I changed presets. So to do this, we go to Edit, we go to Patch, and then we go to Loop Structure, and you go over whatever loop you want to have trails, and for me, it's my 2 H9s, and this is loop 6 and loop 8, so I go to loop 6, and I press Enter, and you can see that that box either is around it or not around it. If you want trails, you want the box around it, so you can see I have the box around loop 6 and 8. And remember, it has to be in the preset that you're going to. So really, this is talking about preset 2, but in reality, it's preset 4 or 3, whatever button I'm going to click on is where it has to look like this, which is why I set up every single preset to be this way. Now, the key other thing you have to do, though, is you have to, if you want smooth trails, is you have to go and you need to click, so I'll give you an example here, but you have to go to the menu that is Play option, and you need to go to Patch Change Time. And I have it set on 0. And normally, when on the box, it comes set with 5, and I believe this is in milliseconds. And if you do this, it's so you get a really smooth patch change, but the problem is your trails have a tiny little gap in them. So I'll show you what this sounds like. So I'm going to save this patch here with this extra added time. I'm going to go over to this. I'm going to play that reverby thing. And now listen when I change patch. Hear that little break? That's because on this channel, I have this patch change time set at 5. So I went through and I changed all of my channels to have a patch change time of 0. So now listen to it again, and you'll hear that that gap is gone. Whoops, sorry. Put the reverb on. And there's no gap. So yet again, remember, when you're doing spillover, you have to do it for the patch that you're changing to, not the patch you're changing from, which is why I did it for every single patch so that I wouldn't have to think about it. Hopefully you found this useful. If you have any other questions about the way that I set up my ES-8, either in this video or in my ES-8 review, please send me some comments below, and I would be more than happy to answer any of your questions. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and share, and I will be back with more pedal reviews and performance videos very soon. Thank you.